What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Welcome to the Just Gonna Say It podcast on Tuesday afternoon. I hope you all are having a good day. Today, we're going to talk about guitar features, and I'll tell you how we got to this conversation here in just a second. For those of you that are not familiar, we do this little here podcast every Tuesday. We talk about guitar stuff just about every day on the internet. So if you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing and doing all the things that you do when you watch a video, that would be awesome. Actually, you can scan that little dude right there, and you'll go to DylanTalksTone. You can buy pickups and cables and caps and pots and everything basically to make your electric guitar go. So that's what we do over there. We make pickups. That's kind of our real job. Me and my daughter do that, and it's pretty sweet. We've been spending a lot of the last couple days making pickups, but we also tore the entire office apart and trying to get more organized because we are very busy. And so taking everything up to the next level production-wise. So we may do maybe the first of the year after we kind of finish it up, we may do another kind of little shop tour because we changed some stuff around in there and show you some stuff we have here at DylanTalksTone. So we might do that in the next couple of weeks. That'd be kind of fun. Today we're going to talk about guitar features. So Matt and I at Texas Toast Guitars and I have been discussing guitar features a bunch because, last week we released that it's called the Texas Toast Guitars HST, which stands for Hamer Special Tribute. And the model that we released last week was actually exclusive to DylanTalksTone. So you can get those at DylanTalksTone. If you go to the website, you'll just see it there on the front page right now in a couple of different colors or even custom colors. And, invariably, people will say, well, can I get this X or Y feature? And most of the the answer is always yes, right? The answer is you can get basically anything on a guitar. You have to be willing to pay for it. But that's where the little hang up happens, right? The little hang up is, well, what do you mean you have to charge me an extra $500 to get X or Y feature? Well, it's just, features don't just jump onto guitars, okay? And so kind of taking it beyond just our release last week, thinking about lots of different guitars and various price points, I think what happens is when we step away from the manufacturing side and kind of the cost of things, we just expect, because a lot of times, you can go on lots of websites. And in Amazon world, it's pretty easy to just click some drop-down boxes, and 2 days later, the thing shows up at your door, and boom, you just don't really think about it, right? Unless you do something like go to the Porsche website, and there is car, $190,000, and you click a couple of boxes and all of a sudden it's 240, and then you click a couple more and nothing is included. Like everything has to be clicked onto that, right? So there's a balance there, right? And of course we did a video that talked about, just liking cool stuff because cool stuff is cool. Not necessarily because it has to do with the tone. I'm so tired of hearing that. Like, well, it doesn't have anything to do with the tone, so why should I, No, man, I want a cool guitar. I want it to be cool. But that being said, cool stuff is cool and cool stuff costs money. So we have to kind of understand some of those things. So here's what I'd like you to do. Get in the chat and say, I'm curious about this feature. Is it really that expensive to put on a guitar? And we'll talk about, because here's the thing that happens. When you put let's say you want to click one box, right? And you want to add a feature. There is a cascading either after that feature in manufacturing, or sometimes that feature that appears to be at the end of the manufacturing process. If you change it, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Everything kind of moves together. So there's a lot of things that affect each other. So we're going to go through some things today. And we're going to talk about those various things because even when you're thinking about a very inexpensive guitar, okay? So let's say you go and you're going to buy a Classic Vibe Squire. Well, And then they changed something on it, and all of a sudden the guitar is $50 more, and everybody was like, what the heck, man? All they did was make this change, and now the guitar is $50 more. Or they'll make a different edition of that guitar that'll cost $100 more than this one, and there's only a couple of differences. And why? It doesn't make no sense. It's the same guitar. They just changed two things, and now it's $100 more. So it applies everywhere. It doesn't just apply to, like a bespoke instrument that's custom made from the ground up, or from a quote unquote boutique instrument from a small builder, but it can also apply to even, mass manufacturing like Squier or Epiphone or Gibson or Fender or whomever. So this applies all across the board. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, get in the chat and ask those questions. If you have any other guitar questions, get in the chat as well. If you want to use a super chat, you're welcome to do that too. And we'll drop what we're doing and answer that question right away. So yeah, let's talk about this. So, it's pretty easy to just say, okay, I'm going to add a feature. Guitars, especially, like take a Strat or a Tele, for example, seem very, very modular, right? So you have a neck and you have a body and you have a bunch of parts, and you can like bolt it together and you can take it apart. And that was kind of the idea, right? When Fender designed those instruments, especially the Telecaster, they were supposed to be modular. But oftentimes people take for granted when you make a little change like that, how much you can change it, or how much it takes to change it. Typically, hey, I want to add a feature isn't typically add a feature. Typically, it's go back to the drawing board and start completely over, okay? Whether that be manufacturing, cost. So, and the reason I bring up cost is especially on the import side of things, when Fender says to Cortec or whoever they're using to build an import guitar, they're like, we want it to be basically this design, and we want it to cost this much. They don't really get much choice beyond that. Okay. They do some, but basically the bottom line is what the wood is made out of, and, where they get the aftermarket, where they get the reproduction parts and all that kind of stuff. It's very, very, the suppliers could be different for bridges from series to series and, within series actually. So, a lot of those things are kind of cost driven on one side. So if you change something, then you have to completely rethink it. Or feature side sometimes can also be on the manufacturing side. So let's talk about neck angle. Okay. So neck angle is interesting because you would think about neck angle and you go, well, that's the design of the guitar. That's like Les Paul versus Tele versus Strat versus SG versus 335, right? They all got a little bit different neck angle, for example. Here's the thing. What changes the neck angle on a guitar? It's not because you want the guitar to feel different. Most of the time, the neck angle is a result of another feature. Like, does it have a tremolo? So, hey, can you get that HST with a tremolo? Well, yeah. But now what we have to do is completely reconfigure the guitar, because you have a body and a neck, how it comes together, that neck pocket, the way it's milled by a couple of degrees, which also changes some other angles in there, which is also going to change not just that, but not just the way the actual neck is milled, but also where it ends up in like the pickup cavity, for example. I've been wanting, for example, a Texas Toast Challenger for a long time with no neck pickup. But Matt's like, yeah, but the problem is the where we put that neck pickup in there, or where we put that neck tenon in there, and it doesn't really work if we take that neck pickup out. Oh, okay, well that's what. So he'd have to completely redesign the guitar. So for me to just have a junior version, right? You would think that's easy. Just don't put a neck pickup in it. Well, the problem is now you get this big funky looking thing where the neck pickup is, which is where the neck glues on, right? For example. So tenon length, bridge type. So this actually came up. We had a customer who wanted an HST, the one we just released. He said, can I get it with a wraparound bridge? And I had another client ask, can I get one with a two-nomatic? And I said, we can. The problem is that it's going to cost X amount of dollars more. Well, why? Because we have to completely redesign the guitar. Because what happens is there's two things. One is the way the neck mounts to the guitar is going to change. The tooling time that it takes to create the tools. You actually have to make tools to make a 2-degree change, right? Because of the way those angles are all milled, it's hard to explain. We could show you videos, but basically the neck is strapped on this kind of like, it's this jig, but it holds it in a certain spot. And then when the mill goes past it, like when the pin router, or depends on how he does it, but basically a tool has to pass over this wood at a very particular angle. Well, that tool then needs to be made at a very particular angle. This whole thing has to be manufactured around this shape of neck. Now, sometimes the neck is made where it sits flat. Well, what if it doesn't sit flat anymore because we're putting an angle? Well, now we have to completely change and remake a whole tool from the beginning, which is great if you're going to do a bunch of them. But if a person calls and says, I want you to take a guitar that was designed a certain way and change it just for me, then all of a sudden that becomes very costly and very involved, right? Which is kind of interesting. Even in a digital landscape where it's all done with a CNC machine, that could take days of re-engineering, because we're going to talk about other features that cascade on down through and kind of back and forth through all of this, okay? So anytime we change a bridge, anytime we change a pickup. So in fact, Matt and I just had a conversation last night. I said, would you be able to build me X or Y guitar, because it's something we were working on, with a dog ear? And he's like, here's the problem. With the dog ear, the angle has to be different, and it's even different than a normal two-pneumatic, right? And he said, and then we have to nail down which dog ear we're going to use, because there are different heights of the dog ear cover and the base plate from brand to brand. Like, that's no problem. I can give you one. We can sort that out. And then we also have to decide how the cables are going to run through the guitar, because when we change the bridge design, and then we change the which means we have to change the cavity design, we have to change the grounding design, and we have to change the pickup route. All that has to change for me to go from a soap bar to a dog ear. Bunch of crazy stuff has to happen. Pretty interesting. And being around this all the time, the manufacturing side of it, I'm like, oh my gosh. Sometimes I try to think of all the details before I ask a dumb question, right? But it ends up being a dumb question, because it will be, he mentioned something to me last night. He said, I had a customer say, can you put a tremolo on X or Y guitar? And he said, yeah, I can do that. It's going to cost this much because we have to do all this extra work. And then he asked, can you put a tremolo cover on the tremolo cavity? And the answer was no. Not because he couldn't do it, but because of where it was in relation to the control cavity, which you wouldn't even think about, because of the way it has to be routed in and set in 1/8 of an inch, and then it's this close, and then all of a sudden you have this one huge big piece of plastic that doesn't make sense. A whole bunch of stuff has to change, which means completely changing the entire design of the guitar to just add a piece of plastic. It's crazy, right? It's an insane thing to think about all the things. Now let's talk about binding. This is an interesting one, because a lot of folks will talk about the feature of binding, and they'll say, well, this guitar costs X more than this. Let's say, take for example, a Les Paul Standard versus a Les Paul Studio. And we've got a bound guitar versus an unbound guitar. Well, if you've ever actually tried to do binding, I know Brianna's not here right now, but she would talk all about this, learning how to do it. There's a few different processes that have to take place. One is the rabbet that the binding sits in has to be routed, right? But it's not just that. What materials are the guitar made out of? Okay. So if it's maple, if it's got a maple top, is the maple top thick enough or thin enough? Is it the correct thickness to interact properly with the depth of the binding, as in the thickness of it, also the depth of it with the body? So if you just have a body with a top on it, you're either going to have this thick of a binding because it's got to cover this or do this or whatever. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes the thickness of the top is just wrong. Sometimes the shape of the top is a situation where it's very, very difficult to bind. Sometimes the thickness of the binding or the width of the binding and the thickness of the top don't interact well with the tightness of some of the curves or the horn, or sometimes the neck joint doesn't work correctly. I've had people ask for double binding, which is on the back of the guitar too. The problem is that the neck joint is done a certain way where it can't be bound. All these things matter, and it's not just the binding. It's actually, this also affects the finish process, because then we completely change the order of operations for finishing the guitar. And the finishing the guitar then becomes many, many, many more steps, where before you're just going to paint the guitar. Well, now you're going to paint and mask probably 3 times at least. And then you're going to have to hand scrape. And then you're going to have to remask. And then you're going to have to clear again. It's crazy. So it's a kind of a bonkers thing to think about, that this one little piece of plastic that goes around the outside completely changes the entire process. And it doesn't just, you think I'm going to add it on and then paint the guitar. But it really goes back to the engineering of the instrument in the very beginning, because thickness of the top, slope of the top, if it is a carved top, all these factors come into play with just this little thin piece of binding. So then when we see it like, we see a Squire Strat that has, or a Telly, that has binding, and then one that doesn't, and they're X amount of dollars apart in price, and we just don't think that's fair. Well, there's a lot of design and a lot of time that goes into that, which is really interesting. I'm not saying anything negative about anybody by bringing up these things. I find it very fascinating. I love manufacturing. I think it's very, very cool. But it has given me a real appreciation for every little feature and every little thing that gets added on to an instrument. Hang on 1 second. We got a super chat here from Tazzy Tim. Sorry about that. I was talking and didn't see it. Good day, toners. Late again. Thank you, sir. Let's see. Let's go back through a few of these and just see if there's anybody who had a lot of holiday greetings and such going on in here, which is cool. Everybody just being friends. I appreciate that very much. Adding a tremolo to a hollow body not designed for it. Okay. That's a big one, because there's a lot of mounting points that may not exist in a hollow body guitar. It just depends on the center block, right? So here's the interesting thing, and this is what happens, I think. Think about this, okay? We as end users place demands on our products, okay? And when I say demands, what I mean is, well, I'm a guitar player who uses a tremolo, therefore I need a tremolo. I want a tremolo, right? Well, then it should make sense to me that I should be able to go get whatever guitar I want with a tremolo. Sure, right? That's why there's Strats. That's why there's, there are Bigsby's. There's lots of different applications. Tremolo, this is a great example as to why, or things that are available that you could get with a tremolo. Or a vibrato, if we really want to be technical. So, I get that. That's awesome, right? That's the whole deal. But here's the thing. We're thinking it from the end user side and the demands that we place on our instruments. But the problem is that the builder oftentimes has a vision in his head of what the guitar he is designing. Remember, a person who designs a thing has a right to design it the way they want to design it. Okay? So, the original Les Paul was not intended to have a tremolo, right? It wasn't. It just wasn't. SG was not intended to have a tremolo. Now, we figured out ways to do it with a Bigsby B12 and a Bigsby B5. And we've figured out how to do things, right? The problem is those are sort of retrofit sort of things, and even those create problems. But to go to a designer of an instrument and say, look, I want you to do something that you didn't design originally in that instrument is kind of unreasonable. If he never envisioned that guitar to have a tremolo, then chances are it's missing elements and will never have elements that it needs to have a tremolo. The anchor points for like a 2-point tremolo, for example, are completely different. And the architecture and the leverage and the tension on the guitar, and when you use a tremolo and the springs in the back, and it all changes. So like to put it on a hollow body, for example, would be a challenge. It definitely would be a challenge. And that's why we end up with things like a Bigsby, because we can put it externally on the guitar, and it behaves in a way that makes more sense. If we were to put like a Strat style tremolo on a 335, it would create a lot of engineering issues. The problem is that we then, as guitar players, will be like, well, why can't you do that? Because the guitar was never designed for that. You would have to actually design a guitar from the ground up to put a Strat style or a PRS style tremolo on a 335, for example. Now, somebody like PRS has done it, right? They've got semi-hollow and hollow body guitars with tremolos on them. But Paul Reed Smith has had the luxury of designing the guitar from scratch, from the beginning, with that in mind. There are it happens sometimes, but there's oftentimes than not that a guitar builder is going to think through, especially when it's a bespoke instrument. If somebody, excuse me, if somebody's, got like a Strat style guitar, it's pretty easy to be like, well, this will be pretty retrofittable to a lot of different designs, right? But if it's a bespoke instrument, it may be designed one way, and it could be adjusted a couple of ways here and there, but not so extreme, right? So there are limits. Phil McKnight put a video out yesterday in which a 3mm spacing between a Floyd and the bridge pickup made a huge difference on a $4,000 guitar. Exactly. Yeah. I've seen that happen before, where you run into interference issues with poorly designed, really a lot of times really inexpensive guitars with tremolos on them will have basically what you got to do is like go in there and like clearance out a bunch of stuff because it wasn't really designed that way. They just routed it and put it in there. You really have to think through those processes, right? For everything to work correctly. What would it take to get an HST with a 44mm nut width? Now that we could do, if you shoot me a message on that, that can happen. I think we're 41.6 or something right now. But we can make you a wide neck. I know he's got a template for a wide neck. I know that's possible. I know that's possible. Yep. Let's see. Let me go back down through this real quick. You got that right. There's a pretty big chasm between engineering and marketing. Oh, Matt is in here. Oh, excellent. Thanks for stopping by, Matt. I appreciate that. The funniest example I've ever seen is the Harley Davidson V-Rod radiator. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And one of the things I think about is respect too. I don't mean to say that anybody's disrespecting anybody, but, okay. A lot of people will say, okay, I'm going to take some car that isn't designed for an LS Chevy motor, and I'm going to put an LS Chevy motor in a Mustang, right? That's not supposed to happen, but it does. And now it's sort of common. But sometimes there's stuff where the enthusiast will go, oh, you just can't do that, right? I'm not ever going to say you can't do that, because I would imagine, Matt would agree with me, if you want to spend the money and have a bespoke instrument made, he will do it for you. You don't have to pay for it, but he would do it for you. But when you see a design that is the vision of the designer, I personally respect that, right? I personally respect that. I say, I'm picking up what you're putting down. I like it or I don't like it. There's no point in me trying to modify it to such an extent that it is not even that design anymore. You know what I mean? It just doesn't make sense. That's a weird thing for me to do. I like to respect the person who designed it in that case. Let's talk another thing. This comes up. Comfort carves. Well, why don't you have a comfort carve in any guitar? It could be a Telecaster, it could be in a Strat, it could be in lots of things. I want an arm contour, I want a belly contour, I want an etc. First of all, if there is a fancy top on the guitar, then that changes everything. I'm not saying you can't do it. There's lots of people that do it, and they do really interesting ways of doing a contour with a top. But it changes the top thickness, which then changes the architecture of everything. Because here's something that happens, and I don't think people realize. You could say, well, why don't you just put a thicker top on it? Well, you could. But then you would have to put a thinner body. Then you would have to recalculate your neck pocket depth, whether that's a bolt-on neck or a glued-on neck, or a neck through would even be worse. All those measurements, like we were talking about earlier, Phil McKnight, 3 millimeters, screwed everything up. All those measurements they're all stacking tolerances, right? So I'll give you an example. Let's take a Les Paul, okay? So Les Paul, the body is a certain thickness. The top is a certain thickness. But those body and that top and that back do not start out at those thicknesses. The finished thicknesses are way less than the starting out before they're milled, right? So you take these two pieces of wood, put them in a press, and you press them together, and they start out as a certain thickness. Then they get milled down. They get shaped. They get milled. They probably get flattened first, and then they get shaped, and then they're going to go through a bunch of little milling processes. They get sanded, right? The neck pocket gets routed. The neck on a Gibson gets built separately and then brought to the guitar, right? And that angle has to be perfect. And then you have a bunch of little tolerances. So you have the bolt that holds the bridge on. You have the thickness of the bridge. You have the thickness of the saddle above the bridge. You have the little collar around the thimble that pushes into the guitar, and there's that. And then you have the finished milled thickness, and then you have the finished milled thickness of the body. And all of that, and the milling of the neck, and the neck pocket, and the thickness of the fretboard on top of the neck, and the height of the frets, all has to work together on an angle, about 4 degrees, so that everything works down to this much, right? And so you've got different people talking to different things. You got different machines talking to different things, and it all has to come together. All these compound measurements, all these stacking tolerances have to come to this one thing. I've seen situations where somebody said, well, can I put a pickguard on it? Well, yeah, but then it changes the effective thickness. Can I use a different fretboard material? Yes, but we have to make sure that the thickness is correct. Everything stacks. Everything stacks. And I don't think people realize that. So when you make one change here, it cascades all the way down. And then, you could take that back to binding. So the comfort contour thing's pretty interesting, because you obviously, so we talked about how the complexity of changing like the thickness of a top so that we would have an arm contour, right? But then also, for example, people asked about contours on these HSTs. The problem is that they're chambered for weight, right? They sound awesome. The construction is great. They're really light guitars. But if you were to put a belly contour on it, you'd have to completely change the design of the instrument internally, which would completely change because you'd have to take out that contour there. You'd have to take out that area. You'd have to actually leave wood in and then grind it back off. Like you'd have to completely redesign it, which would completely change the balance of the instrument, which right now is perfect. So then Matt would have to go back to the drawing board and stack up nickels or whatever he does to figure out how the guitar is perfectly balanced because it's amazing somehow. So all of a sudden I've got to leave a bunch of wood in here, then I've got to grind it back off, but then it's in a different spot in the guitar than it was before. So now it's not balanced anymore. So now I have to change because you're not going to change the shape of the peg head because that's his brand, right? So now I've got to figure out how to add some nickels or take some nickels away. You know how people do that, like stack up quarters and figure out how to balance stuff. Now I got to change the control cavity shape. Ah, crap. Well, that's going to kind of mess with my control layout, which is also part of my brand, right? All these things stack. Somebody asked about, can I get 4 knobs instead of 3, like a normal Les Paul? I suppose, but the problem is then we would have to completely redesign the control cavity, which means wiring, grounding, where the ground goes, redesigning a rear cover, like all that stuff takes time and money. So anytime we ask anybody, and it's totally fine. What's really neat about this, I'll tell you what's really cool, is when it's a small builder like this, it can be done. It's not free, but it can be done. And so you can have something truly bespoke to you. So I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm not telling you not to ask. But what I just wanted to share today was the complexity with some of this stuff so that you really appreciate what you got. You know what I mean? Anytime. And it could be this guitar, it could be any guitar. You know, if you choose a couple of, custom options and the guitar gets $300 or $400 or $500 more expensive from anyone, doesn't matter. Or you buy the special edition Squier Classic Vibe and it's $100 more than this one. I hope that you appreciate why, right? That binding or that, those block inlays over dots or, whatever it is, the bound neck or not bound neck or, painted headstock. That's another one. Painted headstocks are really labor intensive. I have watched it done and had no idea how much labor goes into painting a headstock. So, how come I would really like that with a matching headstock? Well, I'm going to need $300. You know what I mean? Because it's another afternoon. It's a whole afternoon, right? Because it's another step and it's a disruption that's the other thing we should talk about too, is going back to respecting a design. Anytime we do a bespoke feature, which is really cool, and I encourage people to get something built for them. But remember that anytime you disrupt a process, there is a cost involved. So if you say, I want such and such done, okay, well, that's going to disrupt. We can do it. It's no problem. But we're going to have to add this, which is going to, it's going to fix. I'm going to have to, yesterday, I would have had to have, done something different on the guitar. And the day before, it's all cascades. So actually this process that's here would have really started a week ago. And I would have had to add an hour onto that day to fix that and move that around so that the next day I can add an hour to that day. And then this day I can add an hour onto this day. And then now we can finally get to here to add this 3 or 4 hours for this process. And then tomorrow, now I'm going to have to mask this different. You see what I'm saying? How it all kind of cascades together when we disrupt a process. So I'm not telling you to not do it. I'm not asking you to not do it. I'm not discouraging anybody from ever getting anything custom. Just respect the process. and respect what it takes to do it. And to me, I think it's so cool. I think it's so cool. Obviously y'all know I collect pocket knives, and I've got a couple over here that, they're the same exact model, but one costs $100 more than the other. And what it really is milling time. It's that pocket knife spent X amount of hours to have all this titanium custom milled, and that other one was the same, but it's carbon fiber. So it's a completely different process. They're basically the same, except for the scale material and the hours involved. And so when they do a run of 50 of them or 100 of them or whatever, and it just takes way longer. I watch these, I've talked to him too, the owner of ProTech Pocket Knives in California. And he'll say, this piece, the regular one takes 18 minutes in the CNC machine, right? And then this piece that looks the same but has these various features and customizations to it, but it's for the same model of pocket knife, takes 4 hours. Because maybe it's stainless, maybe it's got, some crazy feature and some crazy material, but now all of a sudden, even though it looks basically the same, the process takes 4 times as long or 10 times as long. And that's the same thing with guitar stuff. You could take this, for example, is why a Les Paul Studio is so much cheaper than a Les Paul Standard, because the things that they do on those guitars take longer. And you could say, okay, well, but yeah, that's a big company though, and they can soak up the difference, because let's say it takes 15 minutes longer, or it takes 20 minutes longer, or it takes an hour longer to build that guitar. That's not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. But here's the problem with that reasoning. And this applies to any volume at any kind of volume. So this could be Cortec in Indonesia. This could be, somewhere in Japan. This could be somewhere in China. This could be somewhere this could be Gibson or Fender or PRS. The way they do it is they won't make like a Les Paul, then a Les Paul Studio, then an SG. Typically what they'll do is they'll batch the things together. So let's take a 4-hour block of time from 8 o'clock in the morning, you punch in, and before lunch, you're going to make, I think they make about 500 guitars a day. Okay. So let's say 250 guitars. They're going to make 250 guitars before lunch, right? In their studios. Well, if each guitar takes X amount of minutes, then tomorrow when they make Les Paul Standards, and instead of making 250 of them, they can only make 175. There's your answer. You see what I'm saying? So everything affects everything. It's really interesting. I think it's super cool, but that's why I'm a person who really respects the process and really respects the costs involved in it and that kind of thing. And I just think it's really neat. Let's see. Pickup variations. We talked about going from a soap bar to a dog ear. Changing, from various formats of pickups. So if you're going to do a Filtertron versus a humbucker in a guitar, everything's a different height. So pickup rings have to be different. We talk about stacking tolerances. All of that stuff has to be different. The height adjustment range has to be different, which means the route and the body needs to be a different depth sometimes. All those things need to be factored in. And sometimes the guitar just doesn't sound good with a certain kind of pickup, and people think it would be cool, but it just kind of doesn't work. We've had that happen quite a bit. So yeah, a lot of that stuff is pretty neat. Finish choices. So this is an interesting one too. Oftentimes when I am designing a guitar with someone like Matt from Texas Toast, we have to talk it from wood selection all the way out to it being painted and being done. Here's why. I've asked for things before, and Chris would pipe up and say, man, it's really hard to buff because of the shape of it and this little spot right here, right? I'll give you an example. The reason a Fender Telecaster's horn looks like that is because a 2-inch spindle sander fits perfect in there. It has nothing to do with tone or access or anything. A 2-inch spindle sander fits perfect in that cutaway. That's why. Because it's easy to take around from the neck pocket and go around and around and around. It's super easy to do that. And then the only hand thing you have to do, and actually you can go to like a 3/4 or a 1-inch spindle sander and do that little nook above the top of the neck pocket. So it can all be done with a machine. The reason the Fender neck goes at the end of the neck and then the nut, and it's got that little scoop down, right? And then the peg head is flat. The reason it's that shape right there is because there's a sander. It's a drum sander that to sand the top of the peg head, you put it in there and it goes, and it bumps into that, and it's the perfect shape of that sander. So there's all these kind of little funky things that we think are for a certain reason, but it's really a manufacturing consideration. And when you change that, then all of a sudden you have to change that. You got to change your tools. You got to change the time. You got to change everything. And finishes are interesting. So he's told me, okay, well, the shape, it would be better because it's easier to buff, etc. Well, okay, wood selection. Are we going to paint it or is the finish going to show? Is the guitar going to be a 1-piece body or a 2-piece body? Where is the seam going to be? We don't want it to look stupid, right? Never mind tone. We could get into tone argument about that all day. But really what it comes down to is how's it going to look when it's done? Is that seam going to be in the right place? When you bind it, how is the binding, if it's a natural finish especially, how's the binding going to terminate at the end, or is it going to meet up with another piece of binding? Where's the binding going to go? All those questions. Finish questions are big. Is it going to be glossy? Is it going to be matte? Because that plays into buffing time, right? Lots of crazy stuff. All kinds of crazy reasons, for all kinds of fun stuff. It's really fun. I think it's cool. I think it's really cool to look at a guitar that way. And I hope that after this, you go get your guitar. I don't care what it is, whether it's $200 or $5,000, doesn't matter. Go get your guitar and be like, I wonder how they did this. And just look at all the little features. Look at all the little curves and all the little, this round over right here. And then the way the binding comes up and meets against that. Somebody had to do that, right? The amount of handwork on a guitar to do all those things is very, very high, even in 2025. Yeah, you can cut the shape out with a machine, and you could do some automated sanding with a machine, some. You can spray with a machine, like paint. But really, other than that, I guess there's some automated features or some automated processes for like pressing frets and stuff. Some of the, I've seen some of the Indonesian companies have like a mass press that presses a bunch of frets at a time. But then everything after that is done by hand. So every little detail that you add to the guitar is going to require some person to go and fiddle with that little detail, right? It's really neat. I think it's super cool. The irony is that the guitar on the thumbnail was designed by Paul Hamer when he traced a 59 Les Paul Jr. and literally said, what if we put humbuckers in this thing? Yeah, but it's not. The neck joint is different. Okay, whatever. I'm not going to argue that, but I will say this guitar is an evolution of that in many ways, and it's definitely heavily inspired for sure. Definitely heavily inspired. But also, that's a reason why a lot of the vintage designs endure, is because manufacturing, standardization, right? People always ask me, like, you get onto people for counterfeiting guitars, but you make pickups that are basically the same. And of course, you know, on the engineering side, our pickups are different, right? They're not copying anybody. But if you look at a Strat pickup, you could easily confuse it for some other Strat pickup. But my question would be, if I made it in the shape of a donut, would you want to cut the hole in your guitar to put it in there? No, we've got to have some sort of standardization so that this all works together, right? And the other thing too is on the manufacturing side, that's a thing, but also on the playing side, on the enjoying the guitar side, that's why goofy, pointy stuff is fun, but it's not what you pick when you're just going to relax on the couch, right? I don't know hardly anybody who's like, you know, I'm going to sit on the couch and watch a movie with my wife and play my Kramer Destroyer. You know what I mean? Like, because that's a cool guitar, but it's this huge, pointy, weird thing, right? So form factor is a thing, and we've gravitated over time to very similar form factors because of that. You know, it makes sense. It's not a negative thing. It just makes sense. Let's see. I'm trying to go back here and see if there's anything. Yeah, if you've got the money, I've got the time. Yeah. And I will tell you, as much as every guitar builder really is proud of their own designs, obviously, and they want to share their designs with the world, and you know that's obviously what they want to do, and they want to make those kind of a staple in people's homes. Like this Texas Toast stuff that I have, I'm never going to be without it. Like I love it, you know. I'm never going to be without a Fender Strat. I'm never going to be without a Les Paul. You know what I mean? There's certain ones you want to have in your house. But also I do know also too, and I'm the same way as a pickup builder, you know, you make a million Strat pickups and someday you want to do something really cool. You know what I mean? And just to break it up and use your brain and really come up with something cool. So for the standardized stuff that kind of quote unquote pays the bills and you want people to share, you want to share that with people. Most guitar builders, and I know Matt's included in this, if you come to him with some insane thing, chances are he's going to take it as a challenge and be like, okay, well, if you're willing to pay for it, I'm going to figure it out, because, you know, I've seen some crazy stuff that he's built. And I know he doesn't like to do it all the time, but there is that challenge to the brain too, right? Like to come up with the design. Now, I would never expect a designer to take one of their designs and then like completely butcher it. You know, I respect that design too much. Personally, I respect their designs too much. But if I said, hey, I want a bespoke thing that's crazy, would you be willing to do it? I'm willing to pay for it. Then that's fun. That's really fun and challenging and really cool. But it's in a different category, you know, than taking somebody's design that I respect and kind of cannibalizing it. Yeah, super interesting stuff. It's just an interesting conversation to have, because I know, nobody from Hamer gave us the technical data package for the guitar. That's an interesting point too, because they don't share that stuff. I mean, you could get one and measure it, I suppose. But for example, like this one having the hip shot bridge on it, that was something that we talked about when we were building my version of that guitar. What bridge do you want? I'm like, well, what bridge do you like to use? And I'm like, and he told me, and I was like, well, I really like that bridge because I like how adjustable it is. I like the fact that it's flat. I like it. You know, I like less neck angle. It's for me, it's more comfortable that the guitar ends up, I don't want to say it ends up being lighter, but it definitely feels more balanced. This sounds stupid to say, but the more you bend a guitar in the middle, the more the balance, I don't want to say it's good or bad, but is affected. So if you play, I'll give you a couple of extremes. So if you play the HST, the Texas Toast HST, and then you go and you play a Les Paul, And it doesn't have to be a heavy one. Like that one's 9 pounds. So, but if you go and play, let's say even a Les Paul Studio Light or whatever that thing's called, it's bent in the middle, right? 4 degrees. It just feels different, even if it weighs the same. And then go to a Firebird where it literally feels like the neck is like this long and the guitar's this weird shape and it almost like bends around you. I know it's not, it's totally exaggerated. But by comparison, I just like the balance of a guitar with less neck angle. I've always preferred it. And so that's why I asked him to use that bridge on these ones, you know. Also because I think, although I'm just going to put this out there in the world. If I called Matt, for those of you that are paying attention and you're on the fence for buying one of those guitars from me, if, let's say, I'm going to put this out in the world. If I called Matt and said, Matt, what would you think about doing the crazy thing, redesigning it? Would it be disrespectful of me to say, can you make one of these or some of them, a few of them for me, with a Tune-o-matic and a stop tailpiece? Because people are very familiar with a Tune-o-matic and a stop tailpiece. If I did that, and if he said yes, would that tip you over the edge to want to buy one? Let me know in the comments or hit me on my website on the chat. I'd be curious to know because I could probably, I don't know, buy him some ammo for a range day or some dog treats for his dog or something. I might be able to twist his arm a little to put a stop bar and a tailpiece. A Tune-o-matic and a stop bar on that guitar. If that's something that would tip you over the edge to want to get one. I was wondering about that because I know that I love this hip shot thing. I love it a lot. But more people might like it if it did have a Tune-o-matic and stop bar. So let me know. I'm genuine. I'm genuine about that. I want to know because I might call him and be like, hey, what do I got to do? You know what I mean? And he might tell me no, but I've asked him to do crazier stuff, so he probably won't tell me no. Yeah, let me know what you think. Any chance you guys will do a carved top version of the HST? So that is that's a whole nother question because basically that's a whole nother guitar. That's a whole different guitar because everything changes. Everything changes. That guitar ends up being heavy. That guitar ends up being way thicker. Everything changes. It's a totally different guitar, actually, if you do a carved top on one of those. I'm sure it could be done, but it's a big deal. This guitar is so thin, and the added thickness to put a carved top on it would completely change the architecture of the thing, like we were talking about earlier. So I'm sure it could be done, but I know that it wouldn't be hey, can you make me one? Right? I think it would be a design exercise that would take longer and take some more development and be a sort of a submodel of itself, I would assume. Just knowing what I know about how they do things there. Yeah. I would choose the stop bar tailpiece. Okay. Cool. Yeah, man. Well, you guys, this has been super fun. Thanks for coming and hanging out. It's fun to talk about these things. And if we did a carved top, we would need to pre-sell a dozen or more. That's kind of what I was getting at. I think, so I guess there's another thing. Hit me in the chat. If I could get 10 or 12 of you, maybe we'll do it. Maybe I'll ask him about that too, but we would need to get a dozen for sure. And that guitar would not be $2,500. That guitar would probably be pushing $3,500, I would imagine. Because again, that's a totally different thing. So yeah, just something to think about. You guys, this has been great. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for talking about guitar stuff with me. And I think we will see you tomorrow because we have our next installment of the string review thing. So we'll see you then.